All right, good morning. Let's see, we are studying in Ecclesiastes, getting near the end of this study. We're in chapter 10 today. And we've had to pick up the pace a little bit, but it's actually worked out pretty well just because where we are in the book, it just, to me, it moves a little faster. Whoops. I went to my right chapter, and I forgot to cast it up there. Still in Nehemiah from yesterday. There we go. Okay. So, and I'm going to get my King James version here, so that way we've got two versions we can see on the screen, and then I'll read from the King James as we go through. I think I mentioned this last week, that when you get to chapter 10, it almost seems out of place, because he's been talking a lot about the meaning of life and trying to figure out what life's all about. This is vanity, that's vanity, and that kind of thing. And then it's just like he breaks out into Proverbs. And it sort of seems like almost rapid fire. I think there's a little more flow and, not flow, but grouping. If you ever, we've been studying Proverbs on Wednesday nights, and if you recall any of that study, or if you've ever even read the book of Proverbs, it's sometimes from one verse to the other, it might be a very different thought. Sometimes you'll have one or two verses grouped together, and then it kind of goes to something different. Here you have a little bit more grouped thought than what you would see perhaps in the book of Proverbs, at least when Proverbs gets into those rapid fire. But nevertheless, it does seem almost a little bit out of place at first. I think, to me, I try to understand these things. It's not a matter of, questioning God's wisdom and doing that, obviously, but it just, when I was looking at this, and that was just what I kept coming back to. I was like, why? Just right in the midst of all this, does he just go into these Proverbs? I think this is my opinion. I don't know if I can say this with certainty, but it seems like to me part of that maybe is he's winding down, if I want to use that term. He's wrapping up his study or sharing the results of his research. If you want to, we said several times, I forget who I first read that said that, kind of like Solomon's research project on life. And so he's sort of giving a report, sharing the results with us. As he's kind of getting toward the end of that, you see a change. A lot of the earlier parts of the book, it was almost like he was questioning what is even the purpose of life or the meaning of life. And as you go along, it's like he's getting it more and trying to, get that across to us as well. So I think that's part of it. He's focusing more on wisdom, real, true wisdom. But I think it's also, it kind of goes with the end of chapter 9. I got to looking at this, and that last little section, and especially the last verse of 9, where he's talking about, and we noticed this last week, I believe, that one of these, ESV so the ESV begins at verse 11 of chapter 9. Wisdom's better than folly. Verse 13 is how the New King James, or where the New King James begins that section. Wisdom superior to folly. And so these will both go, so New King James has chapter 10 as just wisdom and folly. ESV is continuing that thought, and it'll go, as you see, through both of these through the end of the chapter. But it begins back up in chapter 9, whether you want to start it at 11 or 13, where he's talking about wisdom and be wise, don't be a fool. Wisdom is so much better than foolishness. And particularly, verse 18, he remember he talked about this wise man And I hate to keep backing up into chapter 9, but I'll tell you, I did a little more research. I just kind of stumbled upon it, actually. Where is it? That section begins at verse 14. There was a little city and a few men within it, and there came a great king against it, besieged it, and built great bulwarks against it. Now there was found in it a poor wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city, yet no man remembered that same poor man. Stumbled upon a couple of different commentators, teachers that were pointing out this is slightly different in some versions, and the idea that here's a poor wise man who by his wisdom could have delivered the city. The King James has it as if he did. It's not a big change, but it is interesting. He could have delivered the city, yet no man remembered that same poor man. In other words, he was just kind of forgotten because he's not well known. He's just a meek man, but his wisdom could have saved that city. Well, again, it's not a huge change whether, at least it's not a huge change in the meaning. It's a huge change for that city, right? One way or the other. But it's not a huge change in the meaning here in the text. Did he save the city by his wisdom and he was forgotten? Or could he have saved, it's like he could have saved the city, but it failed because he was forgotten and nobody even thought to go consult this man with all his wisdom. Some people say that seems to be the more likely rendering, just because verse 16, then said I, wisdom is better than strength. Nevertheless, the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. So that would seem to indicate that here's somebody who could have helped, but either he wasn't consulted or wasn't listened to, or perhaps both. That's interesting. That last verse, though, wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroyeth much good. Well, it doesn't take, we sometimes say one bad apple can spoil the bunch, right? And so it doesn't take much. Sometimes there's, in fact, one commentator, I think it was maybe College Press commentary, says it's a similar thought to what Paul says in the New Testament. A little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. There's a leavening effect, we sometimes say, a spreading effect, and that's the case here with a sinner and his influence, sin generally. And so when you take out that chapter break there, of course, as we've pointed out numerous times, chapter breaks are not in the original. Really might not be the best place to to begin a new chapter, because building on that thought that one sinner destroys much good, he says, dead flies cause the ointment of the apothecary. This gets us into 10. Oh, I'm already there. 10 verse 1. Dead flies cause the ointment of the apothecary to send forth a stinking savor. So doth a little folly him that is in reputation for wisdom and honor. Well, you see how the ESV and New King James render it. New King James notes that the Targum and Vulgate omit putrefy there. But the ESV is kind of probably more how we would say it. Dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench. You could have something dead and something that is otherwise good, helpful, in this case be like a perfume, but you get something in there that spoils it, it'll mess up the whole bunch, right? I don't remember for sure once, I feel like I meant to call my parents last night and see if I could confirm this, but it seems like it might have happened again, but I remember one time in particular that any of y'all ever have well water? Maybe some still do. I know Jimmy does that. Are y'all still on well water? You ever get anything in the well? I don't know how it happened one time, but we had, I guess it was a rat that somehow got in there in the well and died. Now, it's a well, and so I don't know where Jimmy is today, man. I needed Jimmy for this, but I meant to ask him yesterday, and I forgot. But if I'm not mistaken, you drill down to some kind of a stream, spring, something like that, that's where you're going to get your water from for your well. There's lots of good water there compared to that one little critter that's floating around in there dead. But I'm going to tell you something. I mean, I was a kid, and I remember it distinctly because I was brushing my teeth. And I went to, I guess I just wet it just enough to start brushing my teeth, didn't run it long enough to get that smell. And just kind of wet it, tapped off and went ahead and brushed and didn't notice it then because I had the toothpaste on there. Then I finished brushing and I went to rinse. And I was like, what is going on? And like, I remember it because I'm sitting there and I'm like, I mean, you know how that is, right? When you're like, it's very distinct. And I'm like, it's not like, super strong, but almost smells like it's coming from the sink. And you're getting down closer. Why is the water kind of smelling funny? And then, because, I guess I just have to say, because what? What did you say? Because I was just going to say, because me. I had to try it. I had to try it to confirm. I don't know why. Like, I could smell that faint smell, but let me test it. Yeah, it was messed up. It was definitely bad. And so then I go to my parents, and I'm like, what? Hey, the water tastes funny. And that was it's kind of a mild way of putting it. It tastes funny. It tasted like death. So Mom and Dad, they're just like, what? So they go in the kitchen. They run some water. Whoa, man, yeah. So I forget what all we had to do. It was kind of a pain to deal with that. I think you have to get the thing out, and then maybe like pour a bunch of bleach in there, and then you can't drink the water for I don't know how long until you can safely drink it after you poured a gallon of bleach or whatever in there. It seems like that was what we had to do. I don't know. I don't remember the other. But I'll tell you what I do remember was that smell and that taste. That was terrible. And that's what came to my mind reading chapter 10, verse 1. Again, you got a well full of clean, fresh water, but you got a little critter floating around in there dead, and he spoiled the whole batch.
Okay, what y'all not do what Moses did and threw like a tree limb in it or ran to a tree?
Well, if I had had a direct revelation from God to do that, I would have, and maybe that would have worked. If I'd had the rod of God, maybe I could have just smitten a rock and we'd had a fresh supply of water. But anyway, so it doesn't take much. One bad apple can spoil the bunch. We have all these different expressions. A little leaven it the whole lump. And there's another application here at the end of the verse. A little folly, so doth a little folly him that is in reputation for wisdom and honor. Man, I remember my dad, especially, maybe my mom too, but I remember my dad saying it several times, probably because a lot of times Dad would teach our high school class or our even like junior high age class growing up. But he would often say, you could spend a lifetime building a reputation, building respect from others, and lose that in a moment. And that is so true. I mean, it could take, you know how that is. I mean, we don't just trust somebody. Some folks have trust issues, period. But even normally, even if you're a trusting person, somebody has to build that respect, that trust. And I might say, okay, well, I'm going to take your word for something until you prove me wrong or prove otherwise. But, even then, to have that level of respect, that higher level of trust, that openness that comes with close friendship, that doesn't come easily. When you get into close friendship, you get into relationships like marriage especially, and those parents and children, sometimes my parents would tell me, you mess up, you mess up trust, and that's not something that comes back. You know, you can get a whooping, and that's over in a few minutes. And even a grounding, that might be over in a week. But you lose trust, and that might take you months. Might take years to build back, depending on the situation. So, kind of two ideas here. It doesn't take much to spoil a larger sampling population, but also it doesn't take much to destroy. You can destroy in a moment what it took you years to build. And so somebody says, man, that sounds, that's kind of sobering. And it is. And it's supposed to be. It's supposed to get us to behave with wisdom. He's saying, hey, you need to take care how you walk, not in the sense of literal walking, but how you walk in the sense of how you live your life. Because you can very easily lose trust and respect and so on. So he goes on to say, a wise man's heart is at his right hand, but a fool's heart at his left. The Bible often uses this right and left in the sense of right being good, left being bad. Some people even, I don't know, I guess it's probably been way back, but, you know, in ancient times at least, sometimes people would kind of look askance at somebody who was left-handed as if they were maybe untrustworthy. I don't know about this person, you know, he's a lefty, she's a lefty. Like they were sneaky, shifty, untrustworthy. That's not Bible teaching, obviously, because the Bible's very clear that there's nothing, you know, inherently wrong either way. It's just a matter of how do you choose, how do you live your life. But that said, the Bible does use that terminology. In fact, one particular passage is well known. It may not come to mind immediately. Does anybody know where I'm going with this?
Job.
In Job?
Was it Job, or was it Jonah, where he was going to destroy Nineveh? God asked about those who do not their left and their right.
Oh, yeah. I got you. That'd be more in terms of they didn't understand, like unaccountable. Is anybody thinking what I'm thinking? You kind of threw me off there at first, Billy. Maybe I shouldn't have asked that. I was thinking Matthew 25, where Jesus gives this depiction of Judgment Day. And he says the Son of Man will come with his angels, and he's going to gather the sheep. He's going to separate the sheep from the goats. The sheep will be on his right hand. The goats will be on his left. Now, again, sometimes people get carried away with something like that, and they say, well, God doesn't like the left. Well, that's ridiculous. But we sometimes, I think it's kind of a natural progression because, you know, what's the opposite of right? If what'd you say first? Wrong, right? I just said that. I said, the opposite of right's wrong, right? It just made me laugh. Nobody else? That's a tough crowd.
I had always thought that everyone was right-handed, and in the other hand, the hand is left.
Children that are left-handed, so you kind of
Yeah. And I got some kids that will, is it Levi that throws right-handed and like bats and shoots? Austin? No, Austin shoots right-handed with his stick. He's left-handed naturally. Okay, so he writes left-handed. So, yeah, I got kids that are all messed up. But the opposite of if you're not right, you're wrong. And then in terms of direction, the opposite of right is left. So you can see where the natural progression goes. Well, you know, he's over here on the right side of this. But this other guy, he's over here on the left. You know, meaning the opposite. So sometimes people take things too far and act like, you know, in Scripture, you can't trust because of what the Bible says you can't trust. Some people even use that to criticize the Bible. Oh, the Bible criticizes and says that there's something wrong with people who are left-handed. Well, that's how God made them, so how could there be anything wrong with them? God never said that. God never even indicated that. But a wise man's heart is at his right hand, a fool's heart is at his left. And of course, sometimes when I'm preaching, I've thought about that. I'm talking about Matthew 25 or something, and he sets the sheep over here on the right. Well, to the audience, I'm gesturing left. It's my right. So then he says, verse 3, yea, also when he that is a fool walketh by the way, his wisdom faileth him, and he saith to everyone that he is a fool. Well, he says, was it the ESV? Yeah, even when the fool walks on the road, the ESV says he lacks sense. And he says to everyone that he is a fool. Well, if the New King James rendering is better, it's the idea of, here's somebody that just be around him for just a little bit. It won't take long, and you'll know he's a fool. I mean, he just, when he walks by the way, his wisdom fails him, and he says to everyone that he's a fool. He doesn't go around telling people, hey, my name's Chad, I'm a fool. It's not that. He proclaims it by his action. And many times, we'll get into the later part of the chapter, many times by his speech. Now, if the ESV and some of the other versions are a little bit more accurate, it's a little slight textual difference here. This is interesting to me because even when the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense. To me, it's a little bit difficult, but I think it's the idea, maybe, I don't know if I can say this with certainty, but it seems to me it's kind of the idea, we have a saying that even a broken clock, finish it. Do we have a saying, or is that just my saying? There you go, thank you. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. We sometimes will say, even a blind squirrel finds a nut once in a while. And so maybe that's what the idea here is in that sense, as the ESV has it, and some of the other translations. Even when he walks on the road, picture a fool who there's a road over here, or there's just thick brush over here. And so he knows he's going this way, so I don't need that road. And he goes off through the brush, and he might even arrive at his destination, but he's probably going to get, scratched by briars and such, limbs, and he's going to have a much more difficult time when he could have just walked on the road. But, sometimes a fool may walk on the road, and don't be foolish enough yourself to go, oh, look, he's on the road. He must be a wise man. Well, sometimes even a blind squirrel finds a nut, and sometimes that broken clock, at least twice a day, it's going to be right. So that seems to me the idea there as the ESV has it. Now, verse 4, if the spirit of the ruler rise up against thee, leave not thy place, for yielding pacifieth great offenses. This is another one. There are several in this chapter that, I'll just be honest with you, sometimes you read one commentator, and they'll say, okay, here's kind of the direction this is going. Sometimes another one will say, here's the direction it's going. And they're similar, but different. It's like, okay, which one is it? And maybe I sometimes look at verses like that, and I think that might well be the wisdom of God. That he's got some double meaning there, and it might be a little bit of both. But here in verse 4, the spirit of the ruler rises against you. New King James says, don't leave your post, for conciliation pacifies great offenses. Or if the anger of the ruler rises against you, don't leave your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest. What's the healing is the footnote there. So my first thought when I read this was we sometimes will say, stay in your lane, bro. Stay in your place. That was my first thought. Here's a ruler, he's angry with you. You might even be, and this is why I say both these understandings I think are very similar, but there is a little slight bit of difference enough that it's worth pointing out. You might be right in your position, but you've upset the ruler. We might say the boss, the supervisor, whatever. stay in your lane. You might be right, but does that give you the right to be disrespectful, to be rude? Or even if you're not being disrespectful, to start raising your voice? You better watch out, because, there were times as a child that, again, I guess that goes back to even a broken clock is right twice a day. There were times as a child I would argue with my parents, and I actually was right. Once in a blue moon. But sometimes, even though I was right, I was getting aggravated at them. And sometimes I'm borderline, if not outright, disrespectful. And even though I was right, I was still wrong in how I was going about it. And sometimes I may not have even crossed that line of being disrespectful, but they were kind of like, oh, let me tell you something. You don't seem to know who you are, because I'm not your child. You are my child. You're the child here. And so here's what's going to happen. You get out of my sight. You get to your room, and you can stay there. So you might be right, but you would do well to stay in your lane, stay in your place, and handle it carefully, respectfully. Getting into some of our sermon this morning for the worship hour, but what does Proverbs 15:1 tell us? A soft answer turns away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger.
Always seem to be able to take criticism very well. Do you think about Tabitha coming before him, actually convinced him not to actually wipe out his entire family and servants? Nathan, every time anybody ever rebuked David, he always seemed to have a good logical head on his shoulders.
Yeah, he did. He seemed to.
It was always repetitive immediately.
Billy mentioned David. David seemed to have a good head on his shoulders and handle somebody pushing back pretty well, whether it be Nathan or I just went blank. Abigail.
Oh, Abigail, that's right.
Is that right?
It's Abigail.
Abigail, when she came to him, and of course David was pretty hot when she came, because he's upset, and Nabal has answered him roughly, and he just tells his men, get your swords. We're going to go take care of this. And he was angry, and she comes, and a lot of that was from her. I mean, you read her speech, and it wasn't, don't get me wrong, it wasn't flattery. I don't think she was just trying to be flattering, but she buttered him up. And, she really is gracious in her speech. Oh, won't it be one day when we're all sitting around talking about this, won't it be great we talk about how we averted this near disaster? She's speaking about it like it's already happened. And you talk about somebody that was a diplomat. That lady was a diplomat. But, yeah, so you might be right, and she was in that case. And she knew that this was not the best thing to do, that David was he'd lost his temper a little bit, or maybe a lot. And that probably when it got past the heat of the moment, he would regret this. And so she comes to him, but she doesn't come to him and say, whoa, hey, you know this is wrong, and you can do this and just be on the path to hell if you want to. But I promise you're going to stand before God in judgment. You'll regret it. Well, all those things would have been true. But would that have averted the disaster? Maybe, but just as likely not, if not more likely not. But she comes to him, and she's just so gracious and so pacifistic. Is that a word? It is now. That she's able to avert this disaster. She's able to take him from being just furious and ready to go to battle to, he says, well, blessed be the Lord that sent you to me. Because, yeah, had you not come, I would have wiped him out. And so I'm really grateful that you came and we had this talk. And, of course, as we know from the text, God took care of it. It wasn't long after Nabal was sick, struck, and he died for his wickedness. So that's the first thought that came to me here, was staying in your place, even though you may be right. Some other commentaries or teachers, preachers that I've looked at, they had the position of, and again, it's similar, if the spirit of the ruler rise up against thee, leave not thy place. This is assuming you are right, of course. And they kind of take it like, hold your ground. For yielding pacifieth great offenses. And how was it in the ESV? Calmness will lay great offenses to rest. Conciliation pacifies great offenses. I mean, I think there's some of that there. It just, to me, that last phrase doesn't make as much sense with that meaning. I think there you could go to other passages of Scripture and common sense to tell you you need to hold your ground and not compromise. But it seems to me, just taking the whole verse, that what he's saying is, just be careful how you approach it, because you can be right and still end up losing your head if you come at the king wrong. You can be right and still end up losing your job if you come at the boss wrong. You could be right and still end up getting your backside torn up if you come at your parents wrong, you know. There's just so many different examples there. But if you handle that right, I think I've told y'all this before, but it always makes me laugh when I think about Grandmother Dollahite telling me how my dad, of course, you know, that older generation so often if you misbehaved, it was, you just wait until your dad gets home. And I don't know, I didn't have that. Maybe some of y'all did. My mom's like, no, I got this. And she would take care of business. And honestly, I was more afraid of that than I was my dad. And my grandmother, Dollahite, that's kind of how my dad was, apparently, because, you know, she would do the typical, wait till your dad gets home. And so when Paw got home, she would just unload. Well, your son has done this. Your son's done that. Of course, you know, it's your son when they're in trouble. But all through this, and she said, boy, he'd be upset. All right, come on, Charles. And she said, I could sit there and listen. I could hear him in there. And first thing, they'd sit down, and Charles would say, now, Daddy, you're upset, and I understand. And I've misbehaved. And I know you took me in here to give me this spanking, but can we talk about it first? And she said, every time he would say, okay, we can talk about it. Then you're getting your whooping. And every single time, by the time he was done, there was no whooping. He'd come out of there with nothing. Every time. So it was funny to me because it was funny, but it was also funny because she would get as angry telling it as if it had just happened like 5 minutes ago. So he'd talk his way out of it. But he was smart. He was smart enough to, I'm going to use very humble speech. And I guess that was another example of a diplomat, right? All right, so anything else on that? You see in the ESV, you got a paragraph division here at verse 5. I've seen a lot of, again, not across the board, but a lot of folks do kind of separate this section here. But so much of chapter 10 just deals with that theme of foolishness. Wisdom is better than foolishness. But he goes on, he says, there's an evil which I have seen under the sun, as an error which proceedeth from the ruler. One fellow said that this under the sun reference means this is a human problem. This is not an Israelite or Israel-Palestine problem. It's not a problem just in that Middle Eastern area. This is a human problem. Then, now, always. So here's an evil which I've seen under the sun, as an error which proceedeth from the ruler. So here's problems in leadership again. We've seen a lot dealing with that in Ecclesiastes and, of course, Proverbs as well. But he says here, folly is set in great dignity, and the rich sit in low place. Well, here you have a fool that is treated like he's somebody, and the rich there being the idea of, I'm going to look and see how the ESV has that word. Is it verse? Folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. Rich here obviously being a metaphor for, of course, sometimes Scripture will use rich to mean somebody who's they're trusting in those riches, and it's used with a negative connotation. But not always. And we've studied before hermeneutics, which is just a fancy way of saying how to interpret the Bible. But one of the things that we talked about is there are figures of speech used throughout Scripture. And you have to look and see, what does a figure of speech mean? And you have to be careful, because sometimes we assume a figure of speech always means something negative, and it may not always. And a perfect example of that, and the one that I always give in that class, is, we mentioned it just a moment ago, leaven. I dare say like 99% of the time, leaven is used in a negative way. A little leaven, leaven it the whole lump. Purge out the leaven. They would have no leaven in the house for the Passover. 1 Corinthians 5, Paul's talking about there, keeping the church pure, get rid of the leaven. Well, he's not talking about literal leaven. It's a metaphor for sin. But I know I can give you at least one. It's the only one I can think of. But there's at least one example where it's not used negatively. Does anybody know? It's just one verse. It's a parable. And Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman hid in a lump of bread, and before long it had spread and it leavened the whole lump of dough. Well, that's talking about the spreading good influence of the Lord's church, the kingdom of Christ. So be careful if we ever say, in fact, I think it was just a few years ago when I was teaching that class here, and I've taught hermeneutics before, but I think it was when I was teaching here that I ran across that, and I was kind of like, oh, I knew that verse, I knew that parable, I just had not really thought about it, and I feel like I had tended to say before that, well, leaven used in a negative way in Scripture. Well, typically, but not every single time. So, rich here seems to be a reference to, obviously it's put in opposition or contrast to folly, so it seems to be rich in wisdom, rich in godliness perhaps, but a good person, not a folly, a foolish, fool type person, but this rich being somebody who would be wise. They're trying to do what's right, so they're set in a low place. And going with that, verse 7, I've seen servants upon horses and princes walking as servants upon the earth. Well, does that still happen today? I mean, you have a fool, and sometimes the fool gets promoted. Sometimes the fool gets promoted way up there. And you got somebody who's wise, they're hardworking, they're diligent, they're good at what they do, and they just get passed over. Every promotion, every opportunity, and they just get passed over. Well, it happens sometimes. And that's an evil, he says, that he's seen under the sun. Let me see if I can find this. I'm all kinds of forgetful today. I forgot to highlight it in these little notes I printed for chapter 10 from the, this was the College Press commentary. I was looking for, it may not have been him that I thought it was. Well, I don't know. I'll try to find that later. I don't think it was in the, I also brought the World Video Bible School notes, but I meant to highlight these things that I wanted to mention because I kind of was combining two sets of notes. What is it, 6 and 7? Well, there must have been some I had printed out like 3 or 4, and I was trying to kind of combine those, but there are verses in Proverbs that talk about it's what a foolish thing it is when a fool is promoted. He's ruling. He's got he's been given this dignity, but he's a fool. Whereas the prince is just he's just kind of cast aside. And that's the idea here. So, you got a servant riding on the horse, and the prince, he's walking like a servant would. It's not saying that, oh, he's just too good for that or anything. It's the idea that things are backwards. Reminds us of Isaiah 5. Woe to them that call good evil and evil good, that put light for darkness, darkness for light, bitter for sweet, sweet for bitter. You got things backwards. And that's the idea. Then he says, verse 8, he that diggeth the pit shall fall into it, and whoso breaketh an hedge, a serpent, shall bite him. This is another one of those that is difficult to tell. Is he talking about someone with ill intent, or is he just saying it can happen, and you need to be careful? Wisdom, we sometimes say, I'm trying to remember that expression, wisdom is the better part of discretion. Is that how that goes? Has anybody ever heard that? Am I just making up expressions now? You heard it? Okay. It's something like that. At least that's close. But that may be. I don't know. It just kind of seems to me that what he's talking about in 8 does seem to be somebody who is doing this with ill intent toward his neighbor. Whereas when you get to verse 9, it's just kind of a general statement. So, in other words, if you are digging a pit, and again, I think about old Wile E. Coyote. You ever watch Roadrunner? Maybe he's digging a pit and kind of covers it up. He wants Roadrunner to fall into it, and next thing you know, he's not paying attention, and old Wile E. Coyote falls into that pit. You roll a stone, Proverbs will say, and it'll roll back on you. Of course, there's numerous episodes where he would just, heave-ho at this big stone right up to the edge of a cliff, and then maybe he just lets go for a second. That thing rolls back on him and flattens him. So that's the idea. You're trying to hurt somebody, and it comes back on you. Whoso breaketh an hedge, I know the ESV, I believe it is. If I can find it. Yeah, he who breaks through a wall. ESV and New King James have that. That's a better that's a better idea here in verse 8. Breaking a hedge, breaking through a wall. In other words, like a property line. They a lot of times would have these little short walls. They're not meant to be like a huge wall that you can't get over, but it would just kind of mark the property line. And sometimes it would just, sort of enclose a field or something. You decide you're going to break that down, well, you reap what you sow. It has a way of coming back on you. So here's a fella, he's trying to break down his neighbor's wall with ill intent, and he ends up getting bitten by a venomous serpent. But again, when you get to verse 9, it seems that this is just kind of warnings of even in general life, you better use some wisdom, because if you are foolish, you can be foolish and end up getting injured. Or not even, foolish in the sense of just acting stupid, but it may just be you're not being careful. So he says, whoso removeth stones shall be hurt therewith. He who quarries stones, New King James says, may be hurt by them. That's the better sense. He's not saying you will necessarily, but you might be. And he who splits logs is endangered by them. He that cleaveth wood shall be endangered thereby. You can be hurt chopping wood. So be careful. And then we'll stop there and pick up. Verse 10 kind of goes with that, but I'd rather have a little bit of time to make some comments on that. So let's just put a peg there. We'll pick up at verse 10. We did not cover enough of chapter 10 today, but man, there's some really good practical wisdom in this chapter. And we can pick up, try to catch up a little bit next week. We got 2 more classes, so we gotta get going, wrap it up. Thank y'all so much. We'll have a break before worship.